welcome to yet another very timely EMET webinar. As you might have heard, late last night, Israeli airstrikes targeted what looks like was an Iranian military position and weapons warehouse in Deir ez-Zor in eastern Syria. It appears that this warehouse might have been used to convert some of the 150,000 missiles that Hezbollah currently has in southern Lebanon to smart precision-guided missiles. And these smart precision-guided missiles can be used to strike at vital points of Israel's infrastructure. For decades now, Tehran has been using Syrian soil as a base to transfer weapons to Hezbollah in southern Lebanon. Over the years, we've watched as the Iranian proxy Hezbollah has taken increasingly more and more of a grip over Lebanon. In fact, one of the issues that we at EMET have been working assiduously on currently is the approximately $224 million a year that the United States gives to the Lebanese armed forces. And we've watched as the LAF has developed an increasingly cozy relationship with Hezbollah. What we're now concerned about and are addressing in this important webinar today is that what Iran has done in southern Lebanon, it is trying to replicate here just south of our border in Latin America. What we have also been observing is that Hezbollah has been strengthening its relationship with many countries south of our border, but most particularly with Venezuela, while it is under the control of Nicolas Maduro. There seems to be a natural alliance between the socialist Venezuelan dictator Nicolas Maduro and the Islamic Republic of Iran, possibly because both governments hate the United States. About a month ago, 5 Iranian ships entered into Venezuelan waters, delivering 1.5 million gallons of fuel to oil-rich Venezuela. You might ask why oil-rich Venezuela needs Iranian fuel, but its government is so besieged with corruption that there's been a total breakdown in its refining work. Iranian President Rouhani has boasted on a telephone conference with Qatar's Emir on May 2nd that if our tankers in the Caribbean or anywhere else in the world face trouble by the Americans, they, meaning us, the Americans, will also face trouble. And in a very disturbing interview published by Memory on May 30th, the Lebanese political analyst Anis al-Nakish said that Iranian missiles that have a range of 2,500 kilometers can reach from Venezuela to American cities. The good news is that just this morning, US Secretary of State Mike Pompeo sanctioned the captains of these 5 Venezuelan ships. Here to discuss all of these issues with us today is perhaps the world's most preeminent expert on Hezbollah's presence in Latin America, Joseph Humire. Joseph Humire is the executive director of the Center for a Secure Free Society. Joseph is a global security expert specializing on trans-regional threats in the Western Hemisphere. He's provided regular briefings and lectures on international terrorism, transnational organized crime, Islamism, and Iran and Hezbollah's influence in the Americas to various entities within the United States national security community. He has briefed and testified before the US Congress as well as the European and Canadian Parliament. He has served as an expert witness to several important terrorism trials in South America, including an ongoing trial on an accused Hezbollah operative in Peru. Joseph is a regular national security commentator for a variety of major English and Spanish language media, including Univision, Telemundo, CNN, En Español, and NTN TV. His bio is incredibly impressive, and it would take our entire allotted time to read all of it, but we are honored to invite Joseph Humire for this very, very timely and important briefing. Thank you, Joseph.
Well, first of all, I'd be remiss if I didn't thank you, Sarah, for the invitation. Thank everybody at EMET for organizing this webinar. It's a very timely webinar. As we know, things are heating up in the Middle East with Iran and Hezbollah. but understanding that Iran and Hezbollah have a global footprint, that intensity is going to undoubtedly also affect other regions, especially regions closer to home, such as Latin America. So before I unpack that, I'm gonna speak for about 25 minutes or so. And what I'd like to do is touch on a few things. I'll give you kind of a big picture on my perspective on how Iran and Hezbollah operate in Latin America. And then I'm gonna talk about two specific cases when it comes to Hezbollah, one an old case and then a more recent case to give you a little bit of a sample of how the granularity of how they operate in the region. And then we'll end with where Sarah began, which is basically talking about Venezuela. I think that's the most timely, the most pertinent part of Iran and Hezbollah's activities in Latin America. But I also want to end with that so that can open up for a discussion, because I'm sure we'll have plenty of time to discuss, and you may have some questions related to that. So let me begin with a little bit of my background, just adding to what Sarah said in my bio. Basically, I began looking at Iran and Hezbollah's networks about a decade ago. And I began looking at it. I was, before I was in the think tank world, I was in the Marine Corps. And in the Marines, I deployed mostly to the Middle East. I was deployed to Iraq twice. And so I got to know a little bit about Iran. I was stationed in Akut at my second deployment. And so I got to see some of the Iranian networks, the Shia networks that were moving through the southern part of Iraq. My last deployment, however, was to Latin America. Once the military finally figured out I spoke Spanish, they sent me to a place where I can actually mingle with the locals. And I quickly learned about Hezbollah's presence in a part of South America that's very kind of somewhat remote, but more importantly, it's very visible in the world of organized crime, which is the tri-border area. It's at the intersection of Paraguay, Brazil, and Argentina. It's pretty much in the south of South America. And to my surprise, I learned that many of the same surnames when it came to the Hezbollah networks that we were studying in the Middle East, and even some of the Iranian diplomats that we had been looking at in Iraq popped up in South America. So that really caught my attention. And then so when I went to the think tank world, that became my focus of interest. So for the last 10 years, I've been unraveling basically this network and trying to truly understand how they operate. And there's some similarities to the way they operate in Latin America to how they operate in the Middle East, but there's also some differences. So let me touch on the two of the differences in terms of, and some of those similarities and differences in terms of Iran and Hezbollah. One of the biggest differences that Iran does when it comes to Latin America that's very different to how it manages its proxy networks in the Middle East is in their messaging. Obviously, in the Middle East, there is the religious component that plays heavily into their messaging to try to essentially control the Levant in the Shia corridors that spread into the southern part of Iraq all the way up to South Lebanon. However, in Latin America, those religious messages don't resonate in the way they would do in the Muslim world or in the Middle East. So they switch it. What essentially Iran does is they also have a missionary mission, but they above and beyond that, what they speak is on what they call an anti-imperialist tone, considering themselves the leaders of the resistance. And so they come to Latin America with a tone that's much more anti-Israel, anti-United States, anti-West, to be able to tap into some of the sentiments of the historical communist networks that have been rampant in Latin America for decades, if not more than almost a century. And so let me give you an example. So when Iran describes the 1979 Iranian Revolution in Latin America, they do it in a very different way than what you would probably hear in other parts of the world or in the Middle East. When they describe the revolution, they describe it as a social movement that was lifted up to protect natural resources against occupying powers, in the case of the Iranian Revolution, British Petroleum, and the UK. So when you describe that in Latin America, you talk about social movements. There's abundance of social movements in Latin America. When you talk about protection of natural resources, well, that's the mission of many of these social movements going on for decades. And then you talk about occupying powers, where in the Middle East, it could be France and the United Kingdom, and more recently they could talk about the United States. But in Latin America, it's a long history that predates and goes through the Cold War, which has to do with US interventions. And so they use that narrative, and then when certain segments of Latin America hear it, it opens up opportunities where you wouldn't necessarily think those opportunities exist. So that messaging is very different in Latin America than it is in the region, but there is obviously a Shia Islamist element to it as well, where they set up culture centers and they use them to do missionary work all throughout the region. Now let me shift a little bit to Hezbollah. And now Hezbollah is actually a lot more similar. So Hezbollah, I think from the day it was born in the early 1980s, quickly understood that the secret to its success is to tap into the Lebanese diaspora abroad. The understanding that there's more Lebanese expats than there are Lebanese in population in Lebanon, and that upwards of anywhere between 14 to 15% of Lebanon's GDP comes from remittances. They understood that the source of power for Lebanon is abroad. So they went abroad. And much like the Italian mafia or the Irish mafia or other mafias that existed before, they used the Lebanese diaspora as a point of inflection, as a point of insertion to be able to embed themselves into both state and society in different countries in Latin America. Now, a real quick little history lesson. In Latin America, there's an historic Lebanese migration, also Syrian migration, Armenian, and other elements of the Middle East that goes back to the 19th century, basically about 150 years ago. There's 3 waves of mass migration. The first started around 1880 to 1910, which had to do with the decline of the Ottoman Empire and the persecution that ensued. So a lot of Lebanese Christians, mostly Maronite Christians, came to different parts of South America, namely Argentina, Brazil, Colombia, and Venezuela. Then after 1910, from about 1910 to about 1917, there was the Armenian genocide. And so Armenian Christians then fled into Latin America, into South America as well. Then fast forward to about 1960, and then you have another wave of mass migration that trickles all the way up to the 1970s when the Lebanese Civil War kicks off. And in the case of the 60s, it had more to do with Syria and the rise of the Ba'athist movements, the pan-Arab nationalist movements that dominated in the military dictatorships that ensued. So through this period of essentially refugees that were moving from the Middle East to South America, a rat line was developed. A rat line that was developed that became exploited by Hezbollah, who used it and converted it into what they call a crime terror pipeline. So nowadays, Hezbollah has a very sophisticated crime terror pipeline that moves from Lebanon to many countries in South America, but primarily to free trade zones where there's a concentration of Lebanese families that engage in high-end commerce, trade-based commerce with their relatives and family in Lebanon. So that's a little bit of the context. I wrote about this in several reports and books. There's one, for example, called the Iran's Strategic Penetration of Latin America that was published in 2014, along with a co-author, Ilan Berman from the American Foreign Policy Council, good friend, I'm sure a good friend of EMET as well. The book is available on Amazon, so it's it's only $75, so please buy 2. Nonetheless, I've also wrote several reports to my think tank. And what I like to do now is maybe describe some of the cases that I highlighted in these reports in this book for you to understand a little bit of the nuances and the granularity to how Hezbollah operates. So the first one's going to be very well known to you. It's going to be known to pretty much anyone that's paid attention to Iran and Hezbollah's terror networks, which is the AMIA case in Argentina, right? And the AMIA case, I like to describe the AMIA case because it comes in a package of 3. It's not just the bombing of the AMIA headquarters in Buenos Aires on July 18, 1994, but it's also the attack on the Israeli embassy 2 years prior on March 17th in 1992, collectively killing about 115 people, injuring close to 1,000. But it also has a third attack, which happened right after the July 18, 1994 AMIA attack, which was the downing of the Flight 901 of the Alas Chiricanas flight in Panama that still to this day has gone unresolved, but has been attributed to Hezbollah. So this was like a series of 3 attacks that occurred between the span of 2 years at a time that take us back to the early 90s, that no one really knew that Hezbollah had this long arm and this extended reach. It was a precedent. It was a game-changing development in understanding Hezbollah's modus operandi. Prior to that, Hezbollah had never carried a terrorist attack outside of Lebanon or even the Middle East. So this was very much a game changer. But let me describe 2 aspects of the AMIA case that perhaps haven't been discussed. Now, I should say a lot of credit goes to the late special prosecutor of that case, Alberto Nisman, who was mysteriously killed on July 18th in 2015. I'm sorry, January 18th, 2015. And so if you want to learn about the AMIA case, I highly suggest you read all the material that's public by Alberto Nisman. He truly is the preeminent Latin America expert for Iran and Hezbollah. But there's a few things that I've been able to pick up on from Nisman's research, but kind of examine a little further that weren't necessarily documented in his indictments. The first is the financing, and this was very interesting to me because you have such a massive terrorist attack, like I mentioned, a game-changing attack. Like, how did they get them? How did they build up the financial and logistical capability to do something like that, to carry out a major terrorist attack halfway around the world? One element that hasn't been discussed until recently is they did it through commerce. And I think that comes very much into mind when we start talking about these tankers that are going to Venezuela. Because if things are just about trade, if it's just about Iran helping Venezuela with gasoline, or Iran helping any country in Latin America with some product, or vice versa, none of us are against trade. Trade should be open to every country, and every country is allowed to engage in international trade. But unfortunately, Iran uses its international trade as a cover for nefarious actions such as terrorism. And the AMIA case is very much evidence to that. So the way the Iran set up the logistical network to be able to carry out the AMIA attack in '94 has to do with the beef trade. So in the 1980s, Argentina had some of the best beef in the world. It was actually one of the largest, it was I think the 4th or 5th largest exporter of beef in the world, or maybe even higher actually, to the point that by 1987, 75% of Iran's domestic consumption of beef came from Argentina. And so that was not unusual. As I mentioned, Argentina was a top exporter for many countries, a top exporter of beef and a top importer for many countries. But in Iran, instead of enjoying this beneficial trade relationship with one of the top products of beef in the world, they exploited it. Because Iran, being the Islamic Republic, decided to use the religious process, the religious laws, the Islamic laws tied to its import of beef, to be able to insert its operatives into Argentina. What do I mean? So because Iran is the Islamic Republic, all their beef that's imported into the country needs to be certified by halal. It's halal beef. So they set up halal certification companies all throughout the world that manage the certification of the beef that's imported to Iran. Being that Argentina was the top exporter, they set up a series of halal certification companies in Argentina. Now, this flew under the radar for the Argentine authorities because had Iran sent commercial attaches, which is usually what's done when you have a state trade-based relationship, it would have raised a red flag. If you had, say, 4 or 5 state-owned enterprises in a country, but you have 50 commercial attaches, the foreign ministry is going to ring a red flag and say, what's going on with this? So what Iran did is they avoided the commercial attaché aspect. Not completely, they had some of that, but they used cultural attachés under the pretext of their halal inspectors. They're coming to do the religious certification for the meat that's going into Iran. And, Argentina had no idea what halal was or what the process looks like, so they didn't even want to touch it. They're like, okay, it's cultural, pass them through. So that allowed the Islamic Republic's embassy in Buenos Aires to go from 13 personnel in 1983, about a decade before the AMIA attack, to 63 personnel in 1993, a year before the AMIA attack. So they had 63 quote-unquote diplomatic personnel in their embassy, which is a huge number for any country in any capacity, much less a country that doesn't have that much of a relationship diplomatically other than the beef trade. So a lot of those operatives were from the MOIS, they were intelligence operatives, some of them were from the IRGC, and some of them were from other elements of Iran's statecraft. And they were the ones that created the logistical network to be able to carry out the bombing. I think this is a very important lesson because, and I point to it quite a bit, because it demonstrates that Iran's willing to use commercial trade as a cover for its extra economic ambitions, including terrorist attacks, but also I think its military ambitions. So the second part of the AMIA case, and I'll be very brief with this, is basically what was Hezbollah's role besides just the bombing, right? We all know Hezbollah carried out the bombing and everything, but I think one of the things that you start to read, and you read it not so much in Nicolas' reporting, but you read it in, there's a 1,500-page classified report that was put together by Argentina's intelligence in 2003. That report to this day is one of the best counterterrorism intelligence reports I've ever read in my life. It really, it's fully documented. It has multiple witnesses, confidential informants, wiretaps. It's done almost like a legal investigation, even though it's done by the intelligence. But obviously, it led to the legal indictment that Nicolas put forth in 2006. Well, one of the things you learn about in this is Hezbollah's hidden networks in countries where you wouldn't think they had them. The two most prominent that you read about in that report are Mexico, Colombia, in Peru. I can't talk about all three real quick, but I'm going to talk about Colombia really quick before I get to Peru. One of the major, I'd say, logistical coordinators, or what they call the underground coordinator for the AMIA terrorist attack, is a gentleman that's still at large. His name is Salman Rauf Salman. He's Colombian by birth, Lebanese origin, that he carried out the operation to get the explosives in from Lebanon, passing through Colombia, into the tri-border area, into Buenos Aires, to carry out not just the 94 bombing, but also the 92 bombing as well. Now, Salman Rauf Salman is considered today to be the #2 Hezbollah, what they call the External Security Organization, or Unit 910, basically the arm of Hezbollah that carries out extraterritorial operations. He is one of the leaders in Hezbollah's terrorist hierarchy, and he's Colombian, Colombian Lebanese to that matter. So that's a little bit that's mentioned in that report. And then extending to Peru, there was hidden networks. I'm not going to get into detail just because of time, but there was hidden details in the report about Hezbollah's networks in Peru. But I mentioned Peru because I want to talk about another case very briefly. And this is a more recent case, because obviously when we talk about AMIA, everyone gives me the glass look, say, well, great, Joseph, we understand AMIA, that was 25 years ago. What's happening now? Well, in 2014, there's a very prominent case that I'm actually helping out with. I refer to it, what Elon Berman actually talked about this in an op-ed. He said, it's the most important Hezbollah terrorism trial that you've never heard of. And what he's talking about is he's talking about the trial of Mohammed Ghalib Hamdard. We'll call him Hamdard. Hamdard was a Lebanese national that came to Peru in October of 2013. Immediately when he arrives to Peru, the Israeli authorities alert the Peruvian government and say, be careful with him. He's part of a very dangerous Hezbollah network. And we've seen an uptick of Hezbollah networks. Remember, this is in the context of the Bulgaria bombing, the attempts in Cyprus and Thailand and Georgia. So they're seeing a movement globally of Hezbollah, and one of these tentacles lands in Peru. And so the Peruvians immediately tried to deport him, but they find out that he married within a week with a Peruvian national. He's like luckiest Lebanese man alive. He meets a beautiful Peruvian wife and he gets married, so he can't be deported. He gets a Peruvian residency. So they decide to surveil him. The first 6 months of his surveillance, he really didn't do anything unusual. He took Spanish classes, he went to the gym, he went to the market, kind of had a pattern of life that was normal with anyone that just arrived in the country, except for one thing. His glorious wife, his lovely wife, left. She actually went to Florida to live with her ex-husband while he stayed in Lima, Peru, living by himself. So that's already kind of a little bit awkward, right? There's a red flag to the Peruvian authorities. So they consider surveilling him. He left to out of the country. To this day, is not confirmed where he went. We have a suspicion, and I'll tell you in a second. But he left out of the country for about a month, and then when he came back, his pattern of life completely changed. He no longer went to the Spanish classes, no longer went to work out. He was hunkered down in his apartment, and his wife came back from Florida and went to meet him in Lima. So this began to make the Peruvian police very nervous. So in late October 2014, the Peruvian police decided to kick down the door. They kicked down the door and they arrested Mohammed Ghalib Hamdard, and they found him with over 1,000 pictures in his iPad and in his cell phone and his computer of surveillance targets, reconnaissance routes that he was doing all throughout Lima, to include prominent sites where the Israeli ambassador was visiting in Lima, the North American Culture Institute, airports, public parks. So you add all this material. On top of that, they found him with nitroglycerin on his left hand and all throughout different parts of his apartment, most of it consolidated into the trash. And so they arrested him. They arrested him and they charged him with conspiracy to commit an act of terrorism. And they also charged him with immigration fraud because they found him with fake passports. He actually said his name was Mohammed Amadar, and he said he was from Sierra Leone, from Africa. So anyhow, once they arrested him, he does what I think is very telling to how Hezbollah operates. He immediately admits, he says, I'm from Hezbollah. He tells the authorities, I'm from Hezbollah. Why do you think that he did that? And I think that speaks a lot to what some of the vacuums that exist in the region. He says that because if you pay attention, the only crime that was committed was actually the passport. The 1,000 pictures of soft targets, that unfortunately isn't a crime, unless you can prove. You see, his excuse was, I like to take pictures. And seriously, that's what he said in the court case. The nitroglycerin, he changed his story multiple times, but his initial story was it was part of the base of his hookah that he was trying to fix so that he could get it to work. He then later changed the story to say that the Israelis planted the evidence. And anyways, he went many different directions with that. Nonetheless, his court case lasted for 2 years. But let me actually, I skipped over a point. The reason he said that was because he knew that in Latin America, to say you're a member of Hezbollah is not a crime. And most likely, the only thing that it leads to is a deportation. You go back to Lebanon, you change your passport, and you try again. And that was a huge vacuum that we were dealing with and that I've been directly involved with now when it came to Hezbollah's presence in Latin America. And the Hamdard case really illuminated that. To round out the Hamdard story, he essentially, 2 years later, was found guilty of immigration fraud in Peru, but not guilty of conspiracy to commit an act of terrorism. However, I went down to Peru on the invitation of the public prosecutor's office, the Ministry of Interior, and gave a testimony. That's why I said I'm helping out, because I'm an expert witness to the case. And I gave a testimony to help the judges understand how Hezbollah operates. And they were able, the prosecutors were able to appeal the decision and overturn the ruling. Well, they didn't overturn it, they annulled the ruling. And now the case is in the Peruvian Supreme Court. So there's still a chance to convict him. There's still a chance to sentence him. If he gets convicted, which I'm hoping is going to happen this year, that will be the first terrorist conviction of a Hezbollah operative in the history of Latin America. It'll make history and set a legal precedent forward. So why is that so important? Well, because what we're wrestling with right now in Latin America is the fact that it's not a criminal act to be a part of Hezbollah. So that's been changing over the last year and a half, where you're going to talk to me 2 years ago, there was no country in Latin America that had a legal framework or an official designation of Hezbollah as a terrorist organization, such as we do here in the United States, or that they have in now 59 countries throughout the world. That's changing. Argentina in July of last year was the first country to designate Hezbollah as a foreign terrorist organization and created a registry to be able to have entities and individuals designated in their country as terrorists, international terrorists. Paraguay followed in suit a month later. Colombia and Honduras did it recently in January of this year. So essentially the proverbial ball has left the court. The train's left the station. And now there's many countries in Latin America that are considering this. And we're very much involved in the effort of helping other governments in Latin America designate Hezbollah. This is very similar to the debate that happened in Europe during the first decade of the 21st century, where it was a very slow but yet important effort to have the European Union understand how Hezbollah operates so that they can take legal actions. Now Germany and I think the UK are the most recent cases where they've designated Hezbollah. But that debate's now happening in Latin America, and I'm very, very happy to hear that we have some success there. So let me end it with how does it relate to Venezuela and obviously what we talked about in the beginning. In a nutshell, these networks, these crime terror networks that are involved in illicit trafficking, contraband smuggling, terror facilitation and finance, is being aided and abetted by certain governments in Latin America that are giving them something that they don't have in many places. I'd say Syria, maybe Iraq, obviously Iran, but they don't have in many places, which is state support. They're giving them state cover. They're using the infrastructure and the legitimacy of a state to provide concealment, cover for Iran and Hezbollah's terrorists and other extra military ambitions in Latin America. So the case of Venezuela, this goes back a long time. One of the biggest concerns with these tankers that have been coming down from Iran to Venezuela is that they're not just carrying petroleum. So let me give you a little anecdote on here. So the 5 tankers arrived in Venezuela with a tremendous amount of fanfare. The propaganda was ridiculous, frankly. They actually lifted the Iranian flag in many buildings in Caracas, as if this was the biggest humanitarian shipment that had been ever done in the history of Venezuela. They had Venezuelan intelligence officers saluting the Iranian flag. So they had a lot of propaganda. But it wasn't those 5 tankers that I think were the most concerning. There was an additional tankers, and at least 2 that we know about, that were being sent simultaneously with these 5, but they were sent with different flags. They had reflagged those ships. The ones that arrived in Venezuela had an Iranian flag. They were sent from the Badr Abbas port in Iran, and they arrived. But there was 2 tankers that were leaving from Liberia with a Liberian flag that were registered in Greece that the United States found out about and pressured Greece and Liberia with the pressure of sanctions, diplomatic and economic pressure, to stop them from arriving in Venezuela, and they were successful. Those ships are ported right now. They're detained in the coast of Senegal, off near Cape Verde. And so those ships have been detained. And one of the most important facilitators, we call super facilitators for Iran and Hezbollah and Venezuela, is a gentleman named Alex Naim Saab. He's a Colombian Lebanese individual that manages a slew of front companies that engage in money laundering for all kinds of cartels from Mexico and Colombia to the benefit of illicit enterprise. This individual was tapped by the Maduro regime to be a sort of his special envoy for the relationship with Iran and these tankers. So he arrives in Cape Verde, and I don't know for a fact why he arrived, because he wasn't on the manifest. He wasn't supposed to be there. But he arrives in Cape Verde, I believe, to liberate these two tankers, but then gets arrested by Cape Verdean authorities because there was an Interpol arrest warrant for his arrest, for he was involved in many crimes in the past. Now, the United States is in a major diplomatic struggle to be able to extradite Alex Saab to the United States. And the Venezuelans, the Cubans, the Iranians, the Russians, and the Chinese all came to try to help out Alex Saab. He is so important to that network that they mobilize all their diplomatic and economic pressure to get him out of this quagmire that he's now found himself in. But we have some good news. As of recently, the Cape Verdean authorities, this is actually as of yesterday, decided to not uphold the argument that was being presented of a habeas corpus on Alex Saab, because the Venezuelan government decided to print a diplomatic passport, and they submitted it at last minute to the authorities. They decided not to uphold that argument, and so it looks like, and knock on wood, it looks like he's going to be extradited to the United States. This is a major player taken off the battlefield. And let me just end with essentially what's happening in Venezuela, and as it relates to Iran, is very much the same as what's happened in Syria. Syria is important to Iran and to Hezbollah because it's part of that land bridge between the two countries that allows it to procure and acquire all kinds of weapons and military capabilities that they wouldn't have, which is very important for the fight against Israel. Now, Venezuela is an air bridge of the same kind of logistical procurement and acquisition networks that happen all throughout South America for its fight against the United States. So if they lose Venezuela, it's not to say that they'll go back to the drawing board because they have other countries, but they don't have any country that they've been able to develop that kind of added penetration such as Venezuela. So this is, I think, is why you're starting to see this uptick of activity at this particular time. So Sarah, I don't know, with that, I'll probably stop there. I think I exhausted my time, and maybe we could go to some questions.
Right. I have a million questions, and I see our board has lit up with a million questions. But one of the first questions that comes to my mind is Hezbollah also trying to use the Lebanese diaspora within the continental United States for some of its nefarious activities?
Yeah, no, absolutely. This happens globally, right? So this happens in Europe, this happens in Africa, it happens in Canada even. I think Canada is a big undervalued but important part of the Lebanese diaspora. United States and Latin America. I think the key to that is understanding what we call the critical nodes, right? So which specific clans are the ones that are being used as fixers, facilitators, or financiers, and how do they connect one clan to another clan in a different region or a different country? So in the case of Venezuela, for instance, there's a very prominent clan that's a Lebanese clan that's operating. It's probably, I'd say, the #1 clan operating for Hezbollah in the country, which is called the Nasruddin clan, the Nasruddin clan. Well, the Nasruddin clan has relatives in Canada, has relatives in the United States. It actually has a business in Tennessee. So you have to connect that, but it's a very granular job by Department of Justice and Department of Treasury, State, because they can't ostracize the entire clan for the work of its members. So you really have to get into the details and know which members are the actual ones that are connecting to Hezbollah and doing the dirty work for Hezbollah, and which ones are just collateral damage. And so I think that's the tactical work that's being done. But I think that on the strategic level, I think what we're missing in many aspects is public diplomacy, because in Latin America, for example, there's really no messaging by our embassies to the Arab communities, not just the Lebanese, but also Syrian, Palestinian, and in some cases even Jordanian and Iraqi communities. And I think we need to work with those communities to weed out the bad apples. Basically, if you don't touch it, Hezbollah has domain. And they don't say they're Hezbollah. They just come in there, they operate through, because they know the families in Lebanon. So they operate through the families in Lebanon. They coerce those families, or maybe they already have those families coerced, and then they use the extension of those families. And sometimes the people that are doing the bidding in these countries don't even know that it's for Hezbollah, but they just engage with the family business, so to speak. And so I think we need to do a lot of, on a strategic side, messaging to make them understand that U.S. is your trade partner. U.S. can help you with a lot of the things that you want to do when it comes to textiles or beef or carbon or whatever business you're involved in. Or even the country that's exists, like if it's Panama, Peru, Colombia, and then hopefully identify that. But that has to be a carrot and stick approach, because while you offer that carrot to engage in more commerce with these communities, which is what they're mostly interested in, the stick comes in the form of sanctions and indictments. So you have to capture the bad guys, and you have to make it very public so that they know that clan. This happened in one case in Maicao, Colombia, which is on the border with Venezuela. There was a family. It's called the Fatela Chatili family, and they were involved in all these electronic stores all throughout that city. And the Treasury sanctioned them, I think, in 2011, and then within months they arrested the leader of the clan in Costa Rica. And when they arrested him, all the neighbors that were around the stores and would use those services, they were shocked. They were like, "What? He's like a Hezbollah financier." And then they read the indictment that came later. And then a lot of people tried to deny it. Hezbollah created a propaganda narrative to say, no, it's not true. It's the Zionist conspiracy, or however they try to pitch it. But then the guy confessed guilty. He pled guilty. He said, yes, I'm guilty of money laundering. And so those things, those narratives need to be told to those communities, so they do the work to weed out their own communities and bad apples. So I think that's a bit of the challenge there.
Great. Okay, I'm going to turn this over, even though I have tons of other questions, to our wonderful Director of Communications, Sarah Leah Thompson, who's going to read some of the questions that come in.
Thank you, Sarah, and thank you so much, Joseph, for joining us for our webinar. We're very honored. To all of our attendants, thank you so much for submitting your questions. Unfortunately, we're not going to be able to answer all of them as usual, but we'll get through as many as we can. So our first question, with heavy sanctions, low oil prices, and the COVID-19 crisis, how is Iran still able to finance their strategic and military objectives? Is there perhaps another country that's supporting them at this time?
Well, there's many countries. Well, first of all, that's a very good question. I think that's at the heart of what we are trying to study right now when it comes to the complexity of the Venezuela crisis. And let me start by giving an analogy to Syria and what we've learned about Syria. So in Syria, when the Syrian civil war started in 2011, I think we had a max pressure campaign as well that started to incrementally begin to weed out the Assad regime. That wasn't as clear in the beginning, but it evolved over time. And what we realized over, I guess, 9 years now of trying to find those pressure points is we realized that a weaker Bashar al-Assad is not necessarily a Bashar al-Assad that's easier to be removed from power. That a weaker Bashar al-Assad is a Bashar al-Assad that's more reliant on his external supporters. In comes obviously Hezbollah, in comes Iran, well, those are the ones we knew about, but then comes Russia, then comes Turkey. And so now you have a conglomerate of different actors that are in Syria that are propping up the Assad regime, where he's reliant on that. If those actors go away, the Assad regime will probably crumble under the internal pressure alone. So that analogy extends to Venezuela. It's very much the same thing. We have weakened the Maduro regime. Let it be no mistake. The sanctions pressure, the diplomatic pressure. There's more than 60 countries around the world that do not recognize Maduro as a legitimate government. They recognize the interim president, Juan Guaido. There are 5 industries, major industries: petroleum, transportation, gold. I'm missing a few, but major industries have been sanctioned on Venezuela. It's got over 70 individuals and entities that are sanctioned. So it's a tremendous amount of pressure. But what you've seen external supporters come in. Now the Maduro regime is propped up by Russia. It was always propped up by Cuba. It's propped up by China, and now obviously we're seeing Iran come to the rescue, at least when it comes to this gasoline. But there's also an element that the regime relies on, which is the illicit narcotics industry. So the hard part about that, you can't sanction something that's already illegal. Like, you can't make something illegal that's illegal in the first place. So you're not going to sanction your way out of narcotics. The best way is to try to indict it, but that's hard. I mean, it's a whack-a-mole strategy. You capture one drug kingpin, another one surfaces. So the narcotics industry, simply just cocaine, is about a $300 billion global industry. So that's a major player when it comes to the financials, revenue streams that come to these kind of regimes. In the case of Venezuela, 75% of the cocaine that moves from South America, whether it be from Peru, Bolivia, or Colombia, passes through Venezuela as a transit point on its way to North America, Europe, or the Middle East. So Venezuela has become a major transit point for cocaine, and you know, be rest assured that the regime has profited from this quite a bit. So the illicit networks have become a big part of that as well. And I would say fundamentally too, one of the things that makes the Maduro regime very dangerous is in many ways that what makes the Iranian regime is their ability to infiltrate and deceive. They've learned from the best. They've learned from the Iranians, learned from the Cubans, learned from the Russians. And the Venezuelans, while they don't get this kind of credit, have infiltrated many countries in Latin America. And they use that infiltration to be able to embed themselves into influence mechanisms that then create narratives that help them out back in the homeland. And so the most obvious one is this, and has been accused many times, is opposition elements. So opposition elements in Venezuela are very dangerous. You know, I meet a lot of the opposition elements, but I'm very careful because you don't know which one of those has a connection back in Venezuela that's actually being handled by a regime player. So I think that's a lot of how they operate. The money that they get from illicit enterprises, they don't invest it into tanks and weapons and things like that. They a little bit of that goes on, but they invest a lot of it into their strategic communications, and they invest a lot of it into their counterintelligence, and it's paid dividends.
Thank you so much for that. The next question we have is, what type of assistance does Venezuela receive from Iran, and how does Latin America benefit from their relationship with Hezbollah?
Well, I don't think Latin America does benefit from its relationship with Hezbollah. I think Hezbollah benefits a lot from its relationship with Latin America. If you're talking about specific regimes, or specific regimes or cartels that benefit from the relationship with Hezbollah. The cartels, for instance, I mean, there's been another analyst that's very good at looking at Hezbollah in Latin America as well. His name's Emmanuel Ottolenghi, and he's described Hezbollah and relationship with Latin America as sort of like the Federal Express or the Western Union of the drug cartels. So of all the cartels that exist in Latin America, whether they're prominent Mexican cartels such as Sinaloa or Jalisco or Los Zetas, or they're cartels in Colombia like the Oficina de Envigado or even the FARC or ELN, they benefit because Hezbollah is trans-regional by nature, right? They operate in different continents. They operate in Europe, in Africa, in the Middle East. And so if you're we'll call them a drug entrepreneur, and you want to get your product to market in these global markets, Hezbollah has become a major enabler in that realm. And so they offer their services, and they take upwards between 10 to 15% commission. So that's a huge commission for these drug trades, and that's why it's become so important. Matter of fact, I think for Israel, one of the most important things that could happen to debilitate Hezbollah is to go after that drug supply, because it's such a sore, it's just such a Achilles heel for Nasrallah to the point that he had to admit the amount of support he gets from Iran just to be able to deflect from the accusation that he gets a lot of support from narco trafficking. I mean, his line was essentially, we don't need narco trafficking money because we get all the money from Iran. And so he used that because whatever Nasrallah wants to do is he wants to suppress the narrative that his political element is essentially funded by narcotics, mostly, you know? And so I think there's a lot of work to be done there. I think the Department of Justice, particularly the DEA, has done tremendous work. There's all kinds of cases that you can read about where that narrative is 100% true. And then to the Iran question, can you remind me, Sarah Leah, what was the Iran aspect of that?
Yes, one moment. What type of assistance does Venezuela receive from Iran?
Okay, so Iran, primarily, their main support is intelligence, defense systems, and I'd say just the kind of general overall know-how on asymmetric warfare. The only formal relationship that Iran has with Venezuela is in the area of energy, transportation, and military. And so they have these agreements. There's about, I don't have the number in front of me, but it's about maybe about 60 or 70 agreements that they have between the two countries in those different sectors. But most of that isn't very fruitful. I'll give you an example. On the military side, they had a bilateral cooperation agreement to essentially build UAVs inside Venezuela. So they took the Iranian technology, the Mahar 2, and they built a similar replica in Venezuela. The first time they flew those UAVs back in, I believe, like 2013 or so, they crashed. Like they just flew and then they nearly fell down. So this wasn't like there's a lot of fruitful benefits on the surface from these relationships, but I think it's beneath the surface where a lot of this stuff happens. They use these agreements and memorandums as a cover platform to do other things. And so on the intelligence side, there's a lot going on. But I'd say increasingly you want to pay attention to, how would you say, defense communications. I think the ability, the radar technology and the surveillance technology that Venezuela has is very superior to what it used to have. And the ability to use that technology to support militias on the ground. In many ways, they do it the way they do in Iran with the Basij. How they use the defense technology to support the on-the-ground militias is exactly what they're replicating in Venezuela. That's why you see there's a militia in Venezuela called the colectivos that are basically street gangs, but they don't operate like street gangs anymore. They operate like organized, trained, well-funded militias that can operate in different parts of the country simultaneously, have clandestine communication, and they've been responsible for repressing all these student movements and uprisings in Venezuela, much the way they've done in Iran. So I think that's a part of it. And the more recent aspect with the stuff that's coming in through the Mahan air flights and the tankers, what we're concerned with, and I can't say this with certainty, I did actually an analysis of this for the Defense Department recently, and it's still inconclusive, but I'd say what I'm concerned about is that the capability that Iran has on amphibious operations that it's been able to utilize to provoke and to engage naval assets in the Strait of Hormuz, if they are trying to bring that capability to Venezuela to do the same kind of amphibious operations, but around the Panama Canal. So that's the worst case if this extends to what this could extend to. I can't sit here today and tell you that that's happening, but at least we're trying to figure out if that could happen.
Great, thank you so much. So the next question we have, will the fact that EU countries recognize Hezbollah's political arm in addition to their military arm as a terrorist organization have any effect on Latin American countries? Will they follow European footsteps and recognize them too, or even cause Latin American countries to treat Hezbollah unfavorably?
Yes, so thank you for the question. That is a very important question, and I glossed on it a little bit in my remarks, but let me get in a little bit more detail. So yes, it's absolutely helpful. I think the more countries that designate Hezbollah in its totality as a terrorist organization, it helps on the communication front. Let me just describe why, because listen, if you're in, like, a country reports and terrorism report just came out this morning, right? And it mentions actually Hezbollah sympathizers in relation to Venezuela. But if you're a state that, for years, that report never mentioned Hezbollah's operational capabilities in Latin America. It always said Hezbollah is doing fundraising, it's doing financial support from Latin America, but never mentioned its operational capability, even though they bombed those buildings in Buenos Aires many years ago. And one of the reasons wasn't because there wasn't enough evidence, it was because there was a lack of communication. So let me describe that. If you're the State Department and you are studying to put together your country reports on terrorism, and you call your counterpart, let's say in Peru, and you ask them, are there any Islamic terror networks operating in your country? They will say, nope, none of that, no. So you jot that down, you say, okay, I'm gonna put that in the report. But then you remember, you're like, oh, I had this guy Joseph in my office the other day, and he kept ranting about how Hezbollah's everywhere. So let me just make sure. So you call back to your counterpart in Peru, and you say, let me follow up. Let me be more specific. Is Hezbollah operating in your country? And I was like, oh yeah, Hezbollah's here for sure. They're like, well, you told me yesterday that there was no Islamic. Well, are they Islamic terrorists? I thought they were like counterfeiters or money launderers, or I thought they might have been a political party. Or don't they have a political group in Lebanon? So Latin America will be completely confused about what is Hezbollah, even though they know that they're in the country, but they don't have the legal designation or the legal definition to be able to communicate with the United States on the same terms. And that happens all that. I'm using this as an example. That happens all throughout the world. So the more countries designate Hezbollah in the same way legally, the easier it is to have counterterrorism cooperation. And so I'm very much in favor of that. Now, in the case of Latin America, this has been an uphill battle, but we've gotten to the summit of that hill to some level. Hopefully, I think we're now in a domino effect. That summit will happen in Argentina. It was not easy to get that designation in Argentina. We had the political will. So you had President Macri that was willing to do it. We also had important institutions in the country that were engaged, like the security ministry, like the financial intelligence unit, like the foreign ministry. But you had elements of opposition both within the government and, more importantly, within the National Congress, which was where a lot of the former president, Cristina Kirchner, had her political, she was actually a senator. And so there was a lot of, I won't get into details, but there was a lot of ways to basically avoid the political roadblocks that can happen if you try to make it too vocal, your effort to designate Hezbollah. And there was a lot of basically legal definitions that had to be defined internally to be able to get that designation. The most important lesson, the most important takeaway is the way that you can find Hezbollah's threads to be able to connect their political to their military to their criminal is financial, and follow the money. So financial intelligence units are key to be able to do these designations. So if those units are not being funded well or not being staffed well, that puts a roadblock into these efforts. So I'd say there's a lot of good work that's being done and more work that needs to be done on that front to be able to get the designations. Right now, Brazil, Colombia already did. Who is it? Brazil, Uruguay, Guatemala, Peru, and one other country I'm forgetting, are all considering designating Hezbollah in the near future. Some of this has been delayed because of COVID, but the conversations will pick up again.
Wonderful. Thank you. I think we have time for one or two more questions. So for the next question that we have, what is the U.S. doing about Iran and Hezbollah's expansion in Latin America? And why has the U.S. waited so long to acknowledge and act upon the presence of Hezbollah in the Americas?
Wow, that's a great question. Why have we waited so long? I think it's a combination of political priority and just essentially, the wars that we've been fighting in the Middle East. So the way it's been described, so I come into this from a more of a Latin Americanist perspective. And when I would go to brief some of our friends in the Department of Defense or other places, and I'd come up with these, PowerPoints about how Hezbollah's moving, Iran's moving in Latin America. Typically I would get a lot of attention in the sense that it's interesting. It's kind of a niche topic, but at the same time, you kind of get like, this is important, but we have bigger fires that we're putting out in the Middle East, like things that are actually happening that are costing American lives or allies. It's a lot more serious. As they would say, we have headaches in Latin America, but we have migraines in the Middle East. And I would be quick to retort that a headache turns into a migraine if you don't deal with it in a proper amount of time. So I think it just, it was natural after 9/11 to really, I think not just Latin America, probably Africa will probably complained it too. They say we weren't as focused on, or Asia and other parts. So I think it was natural, was part of the trajectory of U.S. foreign policy. The second part, the political priorities, I think the last administration particularly, it was clear they had an agenda. They wanted to get to the finish line on a nuclear deal with Iran. That finish line encompassed not looking at all the elements that Iran's doing around the world, because that makes that conversation that much harder. You're going to sit across the desk from Zarif and say, listen, Zarif, we want you to behave well so you can be a responsible member of the international community, to have this privilege, really, which is to be able to have nuclear weapons, I should say have nuclear energy, which can then convert to nuclear weapons. Then the more ammunition that's out there that makes them look like they're not behaving responsibly is to the detriment. Which I think that's a lot of that, I think, is part of the context to Alberto Nisman's work. Because if you think about when he died in January 2015. The nuclear deal was signed in July of 2015. And I think Nisman was taking what he knew about the Hezbollah-Iran networks that existed from the 80s, that had matured all the way to current day, and how they connected to governments in Venezuela, Bolivia at the time, and the Argentine government at the time, which was Cristina Kirchner's government, and take that and say, listen, there's more than just terrorism going on here. These guys are cooperating on WMD proliferation. And then to take that argument to the international community, I think is the direction he was heading, which I think is why he's no longer with us. And so I think that effort needs to continue. The Trump administration has been much more aggressive on this. I could say that from the corner of the world that I look at, not just the Hezbollah designations, which that's a Latin American effort, but make no mistake, it was also facilitated by the U.S. government, Treasury, State, Justice, Defense. I could just go down the line of how many things that they've done, like workshops, bilateral cooperation, technical training to get Latin Americans up to speed on Hezbollah and Iran. But beyond that, I think that they've been doing a lot of work as well as to dismantling the network through indictments and sanctions. And so I think that work is happening. However, I think the big question is, are we too late? Not say too late, are we playing too much catch up? Are we constantly, kind of behind the 8 ball? We're constantly trying to get just to the point, because while we're getting caught up, the threat network is evolving and is adapting, and it's changing. So these tankers that have happened recently with Venezuela, that was an eye opener. I mean, many people knew that might happen, but to see it happen and the way it happened really kind of just changed people's perspective on what Iran can really want to do. And my theory has always been one of what I call the wounded dog syndrome, which is the more you weaken these regimes, you have to be willing to take it to the distance. Because if not, a weakened regime is a more dangerous regime, because like a wounded dog, it will bite back. It won't, like the Maduro regime will not just go away quietly. It will go away with high levels of aggression. And so I think that's what we're seeing right now. We're seeing these weakened regimes now becoming much more aggressive, which is destabilizing many countries throughout the world. Thank you.
I think that's all the time we have for questions, but we've already received wonderful feedback from those tuning in, so thank you so much.
Amazing. I cannot thank you enough, Joseph, for your really brilliant, in-depth, granular analyses of everything that's going on just south of our border and, all the way stemming from Tehran. We have 24 questions that have lit up on my screen. I'm not sure if you have, so if it's okay with you, could I send you some of these questions, and we'll get back to some of our viewers who have really compelling questions. And I for one, would love to talk to you more about what's happening with the trial of Nisman, and somebody should write a screenplay about that. Maybe you, Joseph, really. Again, I cannot thank you enough for your service to our nation, really. Please tune in next week. As we're speaking now, Ambassador David Friedman is meeting with President Trump about the issue of the extension of Israeli sovereignty over parts of Judea and Samaria and the Jordan Valley. And the Israeli members of the Knesset, lawmakers, are supposed to be voting on this issue exactly next Wednesday, July 1st, and we will be introducing, well, you've come to know and admire Alex Trayman, who's met with us many times before, the Jerusalem Bureau Chief of JNS.org, who will tell us exactly what happened. It will be 2:30 next Wednesday, July 1st, our time, 9:30 their time, so he will have a report by then, as well as the very brilliant analyst, David Wormser from the Center for Security Policy. So please tune in next week. I thank you all for joining us, and I particularly want to thank you once again, Joseph, for your brilliant exegesis.
Thank you, Sarah. It's always a pleasure, and feel free to anyone. If you have additional questions, maybe Sarah, you could facilitate my contact information. I direct a think tank called Secure Free Society, so you go to our website, securefreesociety.org. Some of this information is published there, but feel free to reach out. I'm happy to help anyone that's interested.
Thank you so much. Bye-bye.